time for another AP Language or English 101 lecture. We've spent a lot of time on American Romanticism because it's a very important period. And to me, it's kind of a fun one, especially if you draw those lines up to the present day. And I hope you had fun with your papers. There's a limit to how fun you can make an English paper, but I think a lot of you had a good time with it. At least you got to write about something that you care about, and you'll get to do that again. But it's time for us to move forward in time to actually a time period that is not as fun. There's some really good writing in it. Our pendulum is back. At the end of the American Romantic period, we had a very culturally significant event happen called the Civil War. And in the throes of that war, which is the most recent to have taken place on American soil. Not that there were no battles on American soil before that, but nothing like the Civil War. The bloodshed was terrible. And as you can imagine, that tended to disillusion the country. The Romantic period is a very, I don't want to say illusioned, but there's a reason we call it romantic. The notions are that man is fundamentally good. The romantic hero is a larger-than-life character who gets into adventures. It's very similar to the courtly romances of like King Arthur, and what American Romantic writers were doing was creating kind of their own versions of those knights who were holier than ordinary people, and nature was here to serve us, and it was good, and that's the voice of God in the garden. But after the Civil War, or really kind of during the Civil War, the American attitude changes, and so does the attitude of its writers. So we're back to our pendulum. If we started over here with truth comes from divine revelation, the religious period in America, and then our pendulum swings over here, right? And we end up in the Enlightenment, rationalism, which is truth comes from the mind of man. And then we kind of hit a peak there, and the pendulum swings back over here to the Romantics, which is true. God is in nature. Truth comes from man's emotions and his gut instinct. We're going to swing back over here, and you can imagine what the next R word would be, because that disillusionment in the country basically says that romanticism and that way of thinking about the world isn't very realistic. So we are moving into the literary period we call realism. Now, some of the tenets of that, and you should, at this point, you should be used to the fact that these sidebars are going to pop up for you again. We will be doing a summative essay on this period, and it will come up kind of quick. So, tenets of realism. And all of this is in your reading for this week. I mentioned already, it rejects the romantic hero. And if you remember, romantic in this case doesn't mean like we think of a romance novel. The two words come from the same place, but the romantic hero isn't even especially romantic in the sense that we think of romance novels. In fact, he's rarely attached to a woman. The romantic hero is larger than life and has great and noble ideals, which is, they come from the same source. Romance novels also, we tend to think, aren't very realistic. Comes from the same idea. But when we talk about American realism, we're talking about a romantic hero who is independent, larger than life. Indiana Jones is really a very good example, and some of you did your papers on him. Realism favors ordinary people. And realistic events. So, as you can imagine, during this literary period, we have a considerable amount of war writing. And we'll read one, maybe two, depending on the time we have, of those examples. These ordinary people are not romanticized in the way that the Romantic writers did with their characters. They're imperfect, and the events that are depicted are also realistic. They're things that would happen in real life. It often feels like the author isn't steering events quite as much as authors did in the Romantic period in order to make some kind of point. The point here is to convey life the way it really is in all its grim reality. We're also seeing a lot of democratization here, which is a word that means people are relatively equal. You're going to see an emphasis on the lower class and on city life. One of the contrasts with the Romantic period is that the Romantic period prefers people.
Jack or Dennis, could one of you come to the office, please? Jack or Dennis? Thank you.
It's just like actually being at school, isn't it? One of the contrasts with Romanticism is that the Romantic writers favored characters of means, so wealthier characters and those who had a good deal of privilege to live the way they chose. I mean, let's face it, you and I could not just run out and rent a cabin in the woods and live there for a year. And we talked about Romanticism emphasized rural lives and lives that are very close to nature. So this is another way that the pendulum is going to shift, an emphasis on lower class lives and lives lived primarily in cities. Realism avoids sensationalism. So all of the grand and glorious elements of Romanticism, anything very dramatic. One of the things you might notice in the stories we read is in their realism, they feel a little flat. Even when really remarkable things happen, births and deaths, and the way these authors write about them, it tends not to glorify them at all. It's just what happens. And that may feel, you would recognize it in certain films, I think. That's a different way of filmmaking, that there is no grand music behind the stories in the realism period. With this emphasis on the lower class and on city life, we're running out of room, aren't we? You're also going to start to see the use of dialects and speech patterns. That mimic the way real people talk. In the Romantic period, the idea is to sound as perfect as possible. You saw a lot of absolutely correct English, even inside quotation marks, which is weird. We don't talk like that. None of us talk like that. In the realism period, you're going to see people start to mimic the way actual people talk. Mark Twain, for instance, with all his use of dialect, is part of the realism movement. And this one feels a little repetitive, but I'm going to put it up here anyway. You're going to see a focus on ethical and social struggles with problems that ordinary people face. So if you take this as a whole, rather than what realism seeks to do is, rather than elevate a character to something that you would aspire to be, which is what romanticism does, realism seeks to look at the reader's own life or some version thereof and portray that accurately. It's a very different way of looking at the world. So rather than elevate a character to somebody you would aspire to be, they look at the lives of ordinary people and try to elevate that to something that's worthy of study. Within this movement, you're going to see something called naturalism, which actually takes realism to its extreme. And I'm not going to write all these down because they're in the text that you'll be reading for this time. But there's a sense here of actual lack of control. So Freud heavily influences this movement. This is the era of Sigmund Freud. So there's an attempt to sort of psychoanalyze characters, to look at why they do the things they do, as a scientist would. It's a very scientific approach to human behavior. And part of that is that the belief that human beings really have no control over their own destinies. Because if you believe that everything you do comes from a sort of psychological place that can be studied, then you're not really in control of it. There's also a sense within naturalism that life is a losing battle, and that the universe doesn't particularly care about you, and everything that happens to you is completely determined by your heredity and your environment. So what we're seeing here is the same thing that we saw in all these other movements. Religion, this religious revelatory period, sort of reaches its peak with the Salem witch trials, which is, we've reached a point there where this way of thinking is untenable. It can't continue. The pendulum has got to swing back. Rationalism reaches the same point when we get to the extremes of Thomas Jefferson cutting the miracles out of his Bible. The Romantic period reaches that same extreme when Thoreau basically separates himself from humanity and decides he's going to go live out in the woods, or where Poe, in something like The Mask of the Red Death, that story is so symbolic that it's hard to see any realism in it at all. We've reached an extreme here, and we've got to swing back the other direction. And when we do, we have the realism movement, which is going to peak in naturalism, which is a very kind of bleak, despairing version of realism. So that's where we're going. You'll have a few stories to read. We will also do a summative in this unit. It'll take us a couple of weeks to get there. And then we will move on to the next step. I'm going to go ahead and post this kind of early, so you can look at it over the break if you want to, but you're not required to. This isn't actually something you need to look at until we come back to school, but if you have time and you want to get a little bit ahead, you can. So with that in mind, our word for the week, this is a good SAT word, is sporadic. You can use in either version. You can use sporadic or you can use sporadically. But as long as you use it correctly in some communication with me, either in a paper or in an email or something like that, a private comment on an assignment, any way you cut it, if you use the word sporadic and you use it correctly, I'll give you 10 points extra on one of your quiz or response paper grades. It's not a lot of points, but it can help a little bit. You never know where you're going to end up at the end of the year and how close you're going to be to the next letter grade. I hope that all of you do have or are having or did have a wonderful Thanksgiving with your families, and I hope you had a nice, safe, healthy break. Thanks, folks. Take care.